I'm James Richardson from Click. I've been at Click for about 3 years. For 7 years prior to that, I was a Gartner analyst covering BI and analytics. So if you saw the magic quadrant, the dots in the boxes for a number of years, from 2008 to 12, you've seen some of my work. In fact, you've just seen some of my work before, because the descriptive to diagnostic to the predictive to prescriptive steps, I was one of the authors of that. So a bit of context about me. What I'm going to do now is focus back on the people in the room, on humans, and how we get value from the data by removing the barriers between the brain and data in the best way that we can. And part of that is telling stories. So I'm going to prove to you all now that you are born analysts. Some of you may have seen this slide before. So hopefully none of you are too scared. So let's see. Okay, is there anybody in the room that cannot see the snake on this picture? One person raises their hand at the back. Okay. And maybe they have some sight issues. I don't know. But the reality is that pretty much everybody can see it. The reason they can see it is because we have evolved amazing visual identification capabilities to help us make decisions under stress. We can spot outliers, things that don't conform to the norm. We can spot patterns. We sort and categorize data sets in our lives all the time. When you came into the room, through the gestalt of the room, you know what was a chair and what was a table, what was a person and what was not. We sort, we categorize, and we orient ourselves in data. In fact, I often say that the reason why everybody can see this, or nearly everybody, is because the people that couldn't see it died out a long time ago. That's the reality. So we are born analysts. We can see stuff, right? And the big driver towards visualization and understanding data is through representing and using this visual acuity that we have, be it color, be it shape, be it direction. But the reality is, although a lot of our sensory input, around 70%, is dictated by sight in sighted people, the fact of the matter is nothing remains just as a visual image. We use it as a trigger to thought, and we communicate. So we learn and we think about the world around us visually, but what do we do then? Nothing remains just as a visual, right? We tell a story. It's a very natural thing. Humans tell stories to make sense of the inputs that they've had, to warn others, to really get them to do something, to persuade people of a course of action. And one of the reasons why this matters very much is when I did my studies at Gartner, we looked at, why do organizations invest in BI? The number one reason in about 70% of cases is they say to speed up and improve decision making. But how does that happen? A dial on a dashboard moves, or somebody creates a scatter plot, or a report gets bursted out. Does it result in action? How does it result in action? It results in action because people tell stories to each other at work. We have conversations where we describe the flow of a narrative. And it's really important to understand that actually we do this. You may be sitting there thinking, I don't tell stories at work. So I did some primary research on this because I'm part of the R&D team at Click. So we asked people, if you're making a proposal to a group, do you lay out or what has previously happened? 86% of people said they do. They talk about the beginning. And then do they project forward, talk about the possible ends? Absolutely they do. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Do you remember that from school when you were learning about stories? We do it all the time. 80% of people say they project forward. We tell stories to each other to get things to happen. Now, the critical thing here is this story doesn't have an ending like a fairy tale. A data story, a story using data to prompt action to make a decision in your organization, has multiple potential endings. When the professor was talking about prediction and prescription before, we do that all the time. We may be doing it using a predictive model, or we may be doing it using a heuristic that we've learned through our working career, but we set out what's going to happen. We tell that story. But there's a problem, really. Not all stories are reliable. Stories have an agenda, even stories built upon data. I'll give you an example. It's a story about visualization. Very meta. So some of you, if you've been following visualization for a long time, you may be familiar with this map. It's Dr. Jon Snow, nothing to do with Game of Thrones. Dr. Jon Snow's famous map from 1840, which the story is told that he got this map and he was looking at a cholera outbreak, and on the map he marked all the deaths. You can see the little lines. And then he used this to convince the council in Soho in London to take the handle off the pump and stop the spread of cholera, because he was the first one that realized that cholera was transmitted through water. That's the story. Actually, though, the story is not true. The story is a story that's engineered after the fact. The reality is that in 1854, there was no way that he could draw this map in 2 days and show people in a meeting in an evening in London in November when it's dark, a map like this. What was he going to do? Use PowerPoint and project it? No. The map was actually drawn 3 months later by a cartographer, a guy called Charles Cheffins, and it was used in an academic paper that Dr. Snow produced. That doesn't mean it's not an incredibly important map, an incredibly important visual artifact, and really important in the history of epidemiology. But it wasn't used in the way that the story says it was used. It's a great example of unreliable narration, which is an idea put together by a guy called Wayne Booth in 1961 in a book called The Rhetoric of Fiction. For those of you that study literary criticism, probably not many people in a room full of BI guys, I'm guessing. But nevertheless, it was a really interesting idea. People tell stories because they have an agenda. They're trying to persuade somebody to do something. And that's really, really important. That agenda is a useful thing, but it has to be unpicked. Now, let me give you an example of an unreliable narration rendered visually. This is a time series. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a kind of narrative. And it shows really a growing level of interest rate, right? Really, really high. The narrator has taken the decision to show it in this particular way. However, that narrator, he or she may not be reliable. They may be doing something wrong with the axes, because if I show the same data on a different axis, it shows flat, right? Narrators have an agenda. Be they a journalist using data to tell a story, be they somebody in your organization that's trying to get you to invest in their pet project, or trying to get you to give them more money so they don't have their cost overspend. Narrators have a story to tell. And how do we deal with that? And why do they do that? Well, the reasons are they could be being knowingly unreliable. They could be exaggerating, like on the story before with the two charts. Or they could be emoliating something. They could be softening things. When I was at Gartner, one of the fatal flaws of business intelligence was people dancing with the numbers, we used to say. And how do they do that? Through Excel. And what do they use Excel for? To put their spin on it, to soften it a little bit, right? They soften things. Or they could be obscuring the reality. They could be obfuscating, showing you something else, like a magician. Look over here, and doing something over here. All right? Or they could be reordering a story to make it appear that causality is different. And the Jon Snow story that I gave before with the map is an example of that. Or people could be unwittingly unreliable. They may have made an error in the story that they're telling. They may have a problem with data quality. There may be an omission or incompleteness. Maybe they don't have the context for the decision or the data set that was talked about before. Things could be taken out of context. Again, that idea of how do I orient myself and understand this data if it is only from internal sources? How do I get context around it? Or they could be drawing a logical conclusion from something that's not there. That's the correlation causation problem. They could be saying, wow, we sold more of these things here, therefore we'll sell more in future, without understanding the underlying statistics. So people are unreliable for a number of reasons. The problem with that is that a narrator who may be in error or understanding will report things and leave readers without the guides needed for making judgments. Remember what I said? Business intelligence is about making decisions. It's about removing the barriers between people's minds and the data asset they have in their organizations. But if they're being told stories that aren't correct, how do they do that? How do they collapse that? Well, it's a case of understanding that a data story is more than a closed, linear narrative to be passively consumed. Oh, that sounds really academic. Maybe I should follow the guys from the universities before. But what I'm actually saying here is this is not a fairy story. This is not a story like circle time when you're at school and you sit there and suck your thumb. It's not about being a passive consumer of a story. It's very different. A data story is an open, living artifact to be actively explored and questioned collectively. When organizations work with data using our products, the story may be presented as a beginning, a middle, and a series of ends, but people interrogate it. People debate the live data together. I work with some of our CPG customers where they have a big touchscreen on the wall and people are telling a story and they argue. And that is what humans do with stories about data. These trigger collaboration. These trigger consensual decision-making. Really important in Sweden. Click is a Swedish organization. I've come to learn that consensus building is massively important in this culture. People get together, they argue, they discuss with respect, they're open and straightforward. And that's really important when people are trying to get the most value from the data set available to them. Humans tell stories, 86% and 80%. But they also debate. And that debate is really important because what happens if somebody doesn't believe your story in a management meeting? You present maybe a story in PowerPoint, so it's a static artifact. Somebody in the room will say, no, that's wrong. Or, if they're American, bullshit, they'll say. Excuse my language. Or, and then the person on the stage says, let's take that offline. What does that take that offline mean? It means go away, or I don't know. And that's really important. That let's take that offline is a loss of an opportunity to come to a joint decision. We shouldn't accept this in our organizations anymore. The idea of offline is no good. The idea of offline is yesterday's rules. It comes from Usenet boards in the 1990s originally, early 90s. Rest in peace. Let's take that offline. Data stories should be told and debated right in the moment to get the most insight and to be innovative together. Really, really important. So if offline is not now, when and where is now? I mean, when we tell stories to people, when we look at stories collectively, when we debate them, when we try and get rid of the unreliable narrator, where do we do it? Well, increasingly we do it on devices that have become pervasive. Well, we did some research around devices. So if people are telling stories to each other and people are consuming stories that other people have made in data, how does that happen? Where does it happen? Well, it happens increasingly on their mobile devices, which are now indistinguishable from their normal life. I hate to think how many computing devices there are in the room right now, more than there are people, I would expect. All of them connected to the World Wide Web. The research that we've done, the primary research we've done, admittedly small sample, says that people are working in parallel. So you're sat listening to my presentation. Some of you are checking your emails. Some of you are making a decision. Some of you are probably Facebooking or whatever. It's no longer considered rude. That is what we do. That is how we live. And our business intelligence and our stories has to deal with multi-device lensing. People look at the same information on different devices, and those stories get consumed as we flow through our day. So it's really important to realize that data stories are about humans getting access and telling those stories to each other because they help prompt action, which is the holy grail of business intelligence. But data stories don't have a denouement. They don't have a everybody lived happily ever after. They have possible outcomes. Any data story that somebody tells you, whether it's in the media or whether it's at work, whether it's in PowerPoint, whether it's in ClickSense, our products, or ClickView, these need to be interrogated collectively because people have an agenda. It may be an unwitting agenda. They may not know they're being unreliable, but the best way to get the juice from the data is to discuss it together. Data stories help resolve questions and issues now through the devices that we have in our hands. A story can be packaged up and sent out to you, and then you can debate it asynchronously. Really important to realize that not everybody has to be in the room at the same time. And finally, stories are really powerful. People find them compelling. They like stories. And to go back to Dr. John Snow, when he convinced people to take the local councillors to take the handle off the pump at Broad Street in London, he didn't do it with a visualization. He told them a story. If you don't take the handle off the pump, 1,000 people will die. He told them a story that they understood, not through a visual form, but in a narrative. And they got it, and they did it, and they took action. And that is what you want to happen in your organizations when people tell data stories. Thank you very much.